あのバッジを見るな海賊ども。
ソゲキング。
Subscribe to that channel.
了解。シャツファイヤーバトルスター。
まさか。
完了。
Hello everyone, I'm here once again, twice this week now with extra videos, this time to talk about the rotation announcement that they made on Sunday morning, and just wanted to give you guys my thoughts and where I'm at. So to start off, I'll go over what the announcement was. For those who have your cards in front of you, if you look down in the bottom right hand corner, there's a little gum fruit symbol with a number in it. The new rotation system says that all cards with the 1 in their bottom right-hand corner will stop being legal in April of 2026. For context, that's sets 1 through 4, plus all of the starter decks up until ST10. ST10 is the first set that included the second Gum number and is part of the second block. Other questions, in case people are wondering, if they reprint a card, they will be including it with an updated number. So if they reprinted, for example, the OP01 Nami again today, its original symbol would have been a 1. The reprinted one at this point would be a 3 if they reprinted it today. And all of the 1 or 3 marked OP01 Namis would be legal as long as block 3 is legal. So if they do reprints, it means that old cards are still valuable. All of your old alt arts will retain their value if they get reprinted. And if they don't get reprinted, you just have to look at them as collector's items. And I'll get into some of the pros and cons with the rotation later in the video. Other things to be aware of, there is going to be an eternal format they announced, or something along those lines. I don't remember the exact wording they used, which will include all of the cards regardless of their block. That format is getting support, but I would expect it to be a kind of secondary format. So if you are trying to play in the largest number of tournaments possible, you would want to play this standard and have decks for this standard format. So I think that is a pretty good explanation. If you have any other questions and I have answers for them, drop them in the comments and I will do my best to answer any questions you might have about it. And then I wanted to go into how I'm going to, or how I've been thinking about this announcement and what it means for the health of the game. So I have some starting assumptions here. These are the assumptions that I am using to determine whether or not this rotation is good for the game. If you don't agree with me on some of these assumptions of what is good for a game, that's okay. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't mean I'm right or anything else like that. It's just a difference of opinion on what makes a healthy meta, and people are allowed to disagree on that. But I would ask you, if you are disagreeing with me on those assumptions, go ahead and drop those in the comments now so that we can hash those out and then we can maybe see where things fall afterwards. I go forward with all of my arguments and kind of pros and cons in the context of these assumptions. So I'm going to be operating under the knowledge that that is what you continuing to watch is going to be in context of. I'm sure that was all sorts of confusing, that phrasing, but suffice it to say that if you agree with these starting assumptions, I hope you will be able to follow my arguments, and if you don't, drop it down in the comments and we can discuss further. So to get into the assumptions, there are a couple things that I think are desirable traits for a game of this style. First being a dynamic and shifting meta. And you're going to see a lot of quotes in these things because a lot of these things don't have hard and fast definitions and are in some sense, available to be interrogated as opinion. So this first one, dynamic and shifting meta. The idea with this one is that players don't generally want to play in metas that don't change. They get stale is a common parlance for them. And they want metas that are internally fun to play. So that's one of my first assumptions. The next is that a low barrier of entry for new players is a good thing. I say that in that as older players play the game, some of them will drop off and they will need to be replaced. And then the more new players you bring into a game, the more investment that the company can put into it, because we're still in a economic system that requires companies do things for their own bottom line rather than for the good of the players. A constant flow of new players I consider to be a good thing. Another thing is that when you are investing in these hobbies, which investment in the strongest of quotes, because this is a hobby, it's meant to cost some amount of money in our system as we know it. It is a benefit to a game if the amount of risk you take on when doing your investment in a hobby is obvious from the start. And I'll get into it more when I go through the points on this. But I think that is probably somewhat self-evident that investment risk readability is a good thing. And then finally, a gentle, in quotes, because I think that power and complexity creep, as I will define them more later, are some things that are in some ways inevitable in the TCG space and in general gaming as well. But I think that insofar as we can manage power and complexity creep, it is a good thing for those things to be a smooth and kind of slow advance. But I'll get more into it when we get to that point. So those are my starting assumptions. And if you, again, have any disagreements with these starting assumptions, drop into the comments and let me know. And maybe we chat out the other bits there. All right, getting into the first one, a dynamic and shifting meta. To remind you guys or reiterate what I'm referring to, a meta that is changing frequently enough to where players don't get bored of it, and one that is internally fun to play. If everyone's playing the same deck, that can be dynamic even if it is not very varied. But the gameplay has to be interesting. So, pros for the rotation system here is that there are guaranteed meta shifts. The shifting of the meta is baked into this time-bound rotation system, which means that it is, going to the second point, that it is predictable. When meta shifts are going to happen, you know when they're going to happen, and you can make plans around them. It's kind of one of the strengths to the system is that because it's so predictable, you can use that information to your competitive advantage or to a lot of different advantages that we'll cover as we go through these different points. The cons to it is that rotation does not necessarily make healthy shifts. That's not a given. And there will be times where the strongest deck in the meta only gets stronger because its competition rotates out. So that is a risk to this, but it's not necessarily one that is a guarantee to happen. Some rotations will be good, some will be bad, but those rotations will not be concerned necessarily with the timing of the of rotation. A good designer can improve on this and make it to where they design decks to ebb and flow alongside the rotation system, but I don't want to assume that Bandai will be better or worse than any particular assumption. Another con, potentially, is it doesn't affect all decks equally. Some decks will be very rotation-proof in some sense, and that every time there's a rotation, they lose almost nothing, and they continue at their current power level until they eventually themselves rotate out entirely. And then other decks will have ebbs and flows literally every rotation, where some of their best pieces rotate out and they end up getting replaced in the next block, and that will ebb and flow, and you'll have some decks that have kind of a varied power level depending on where they're at in the rotation, and others will lock in at one point and they will stay. So I'm going to put that as a con, even though I don't think that one is necessarily a huge con. It's just something that is a reality, is some decks are going to get more support in a set, some decks are going to get more affected by a ban when bans happen, those sorts of things. So those are my thoughts on kind of rotation as it pertains to the dynamism and the shifts in the meta. Next, the new player barrier to entry. The pros to the rotation system is there is a lot less cards that a new player has to be aware of or acquire for entering into the game. This can be useful for the people who've been playing as long as I have and been playing since 01. We have access to a lot of cards that a brand new player might not. And a new player entering into a system with rotation only has to consider the most recent approximately 3 years, 3 blocks worth of content, which means the availability of cards should be better. And to go with that, the number of cards they need to learn to become proficient in a meta is also smaller. Now, I don't want to overstate the learning piece. Most metas don't actually include all that many cards. This is more of a concession to rogue decks. New players can lose to rogue decks that is just like, I didn't even know that card existed. And that problem is exacerbated when you don't have a rotation system. And then cons. One of the things that I think this is probably going to be one of the most cited risks to a rotation system is there is a lot of anxiety in the whole player base, including for new players, right around when rotations happen, particularly just before. So a new player coming in maybe 2 months before a rotation will have to make the decision, do I play what is potentially the best decks in the format at the risk of those decks losing a lot of core pieces and moving out of the meta as a result? Or do I take a deck that is rotation proof or is very minimally affected by the rotation? And that anxiety of making that decision can push people into a wait and see kind of attitude, which can be a barrier to new players entering. Another thing, which I think is a smaller thing, but not negligible, is that rotation resets learning. So if a player enters in maybe not 2 months before rotation, but they enter in 6 months before rotation, they may be a good ways into their learning journey, and then rotation may reset some of that. Some of the cards that they got used to are gone now, and so they have to the increase in new cards can be a lot more overwhelming to new players than it is to older players. So that's what I have to say about rotation and new players. The next one is the investment opacity. In general, being able to enter into an investment with better knowledge of card value is a good thing. It allows you to make better decisions. Now, going into pros, investment risk due to the meta shifts is more predictable. I don't want to say entirely predictable because new cards being printed will cause meta shifts that are generally smaller than what rotation does, but are still meaningful meta shifts that can drastically affect investment. Those set by set investments are ones that appear in any system or any type of rotation alternative. So I don't want to overstate that point. And I do think that because every system kind of is baked in with that new meta based on new sets, that it is a meaningful pro in the rotation thing that you can predict when your meta is going to shift. The other thing is that when you have a hard cap on the lifespan of a card's play time in standard, there should be a downward pressure on the price. This isn't going to be universal, But if a card has a cap at 3 years and you know that the longest it can be played is for 3 years, it is less valuable on average than a card that can be played forever. So the investment, the ask of people buying in should be lower, so that reduces the overall risk. On the other side, cons, the wait until rotation piece is something that is more apparent when it comes to high value cards. And if we have players who make decisions more on the potential loss of value in a card rather than the enjoyment in the card game, that would be something that would be a negative. The other one, and this is going to be the other thing that most people really hate to see, is that non-collectibles drop precipitously in price on rotation. If you have a card that's really good in standard but is not good in Eternal, it will drop off a cliff, usually a little bit before rotation, as far as price goes. So that is a risk that is introduced for players that they didn't have to experience before. With rotation, that kind of artificial is maybe too negative a connotation. The kind of forced meta rotation is one that really can negatively affect card prices, which makes them less attractive as investments, which, depending on your perspective, may or may not be a problem. But I will treat it here kind of as a con, because I think that a lot of people feel like they want their cards to hold value. So that is the investment opacity. The final point I'll mention, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean by power creep and complexity creep, is it is desirable that those creep curves stay gentle. So to go into what power creep and complexity creep are, the general dynamic by which card games slowly become more powerful is what's generally called power creep, and then the general trend to cards becoming more complex is what I'd call complexity creep. I think that both of these things are kind of natural in any long-term game, even so far as including something like chess. The complexity creep on chess has increased as time goes on, as people get to learn more from maybe game engines in chess, and the amount of foreknowledge you need to kind of get to competitiveness can increase because of that. And power creep, not something you necessarily see in chess, but power creep is something that, in order to keep players buying into the game, which is kind of an outcropping of our economic system, it is important that cards be interesting enough to supplant the older versions. A common way that this happens is with power creep. The complaints about in fighting games how DLC characters have advantages, the pay to win things. It makes sense for companies to charge money for better cards, and this kind of a impulse is negative in general for card games, or for most games, in fact, because what it does is it changes the texture of the game in a way that may take away some of the charm of it, by complexity creep kind of pushing out simple strategies. It can increase the learning curves for new players. Power creep can, in its worst form, become something of a pay to win. So those are why I think that a gentle creep curve is generally better, because I think that you can't fully eliminate the two processes without losing some of the growth in a game. Games become stale if they don't have any power creep or any complexity creep. Players will get tired of doing the same thing at the same power level the whole time. They want to do something more traditionally. So pros for rotation. Rotation is a creep agnostic way of producing dynamism. You can make a meta shift without having to increase the power level of cards or the complexity of cards just by introducing a rotation. This changes the context of individual cards in a well-designed game, which hopefully we have to assume that Bandai will produce a well-designed game. And that changing context allows designers to pull back on the dials for power creep and pull back on the dials for complexity creep and still maintain some kind of interest in the game. The other thing that I think is really important for this is there are certain cards that will come into a meta that aren't necessarily power crept, but are ones that limit what cards can be printed in a responsible way. The examples I have here is Nami and Enel. I do think that Nami is a very interesting card that deserves its place in the meta, but it is a kind of designed card that kind of warps card design around it. One of the upsides to rotation is that even when one of those cards is not worth a ban, it has a kind of cap on how long it can negatively affect the design space. So I put that in the pros category. On the con side, and I do think that there's only one con on this slide because I think this is a big one. There is no guarantee that rotation actually prevents power creep or complexity creep. That is on the designers to do. If they are going to power creep the game, it doesn't matter if we do rotation or not. The upside to rotation is that it makes it to where a designer can choose not to power creep or complexity creep the game and maintain kind of the well-flowingness of it. But I do want to emphasize, it is not a guarantee that the designers won't go into additional power creep and beyond. So those are the main 4 points that I wanted to touch on with rotation. Next, I want to get into some of the cards that are affected before I end with some conclusions. So what's affected? There are 40 leaders that are affected by rotation. And again, this doesn't happen until April of 2026. So we have plenty of time to kind of settle in and further evaluate some implications, but I wanted to just kind of call out a couple of them. I have Monkey D. Luffy here as representative of all of the starter decks. The starter decks are good entry-level products for new players, and their rotation is one that comes with some obvious downsides. If a player only buys a precon or they find an old precon, they will not be able to play that even as an introductory product, so that there is a kind of give and take there. By the same token, a new precon does not have to necessarily compete with cards that are from a long time ago. So there's a little bit of give and take with the idea that starter decks rotate. The next one I want to call out, I have Smoker here as a representative of meta decks. Some decks that are currently in the meta will be affected by this and will just be straight kicked out of the meta unless they get a reprint. And I think this is where I think you'll hear most of the complaints. Somebody will be playing a meta deck that they really like and they're having great success with, and after rotation they may have difficulties finding a new deck or justifying investing in a new deck. And that will happen with every rotation. There will be decks that are meta that end up being chopped out of the meta by the rotation. The last one I have here is I have Vivi, which is representative of kind of a more fan favorite one. I put it here because it's one of my favorite leaders. And this is a leader that, while it was never super competitive, is one that now no longer gets to be played at all in the standard format. You do get to still play them in the Eternal formats, and I think if you were already playing a more casual game with more casual players, most casual games will probably happen in the Eternal format, not in the standard format. At least insofar that the players are of similar duration in the game. New players may prefer to play the standard format until their first deck does rotate, and then they'll usually switch over to the Eternal one. But for those who are loyalists to decks, it doesn't matter where your deck falls on one of these things, rotation will affect you. And I think that's the group that I feel the most I feel your emotions in some sense, because I know what it feels like to have a deck that you really, really click with and have it be pulled away. Out of the top 5 of my decks that I went over in my tier list just recently, Red Green Law, Blue Red Vivi, and Blue Purple Crocodile are all on the rotation list. And the only 2 that are left is Yellow Purple Robin and Yellow Green Law. So I know what you mean. I know how you're feeling with your favorite decks all getting rotated. It hurts. It's unfortunately something that is part of most games, not necessarily rotation, but your deck's falling out of favor or your deck getting banned. It's a dramatic feeling, but it's one that I think is pretty common in TCG games. So I just would ask that you take heart and maybe look into playing the Eternal formats. Moving on to the rest of the cards, I wanted to call out a couple different categories of cards that'll be affected with these that could be interesting to discuss. First one I have here is this Jewelry Bonnie. Searchers, I think, is one of the card types that you're going to feel the missing the most. I do think that this is also kind of a double-edged point, though, in that Searchers, if you have too many of them, can be over-centralizing, and then decks can get a little too consistent. And then it's the variance element that is often cited as a positive for TCGs, in that even players who are new to the game can get wins due to variance. Searchers kind of reduce variance, and there's kind of a double-edged sword both ways. If you lose all of the Searchers for your deck to rotation, your deck will feel a lot weaker. But if you don't do rotation and then you end up with options of 6 different Searchers, you end up with decks that are maybe too consistent. And then you see stuff like the Green Purple Luffy from EBO2, who's extremely consistent because it has so many access to so many Searchers, and it can find the cards it needs almost every game, and that consistency can actually be a detriment to the enjoyability of the game. The next card category I wanted to call out is the really big game-changing cards. I think Kid is one of the best examples from the first 4 sets of a card that in and of itself generates an archetype. The whole fortress style of play that works pretty well in Bonnie has worked well in the past in Yamato, and in Kid is a type of deck that cannot exist without Kid. And if he rotates fully and doesn't get reprinted, then that style of gameplay will be out of the meta until something new replaces it, or they reprint Kid. I did want to call out that both Jewelry Bonnie and Captain Kidd may get reprinted. We have the Bonnie starter deck coming later this year, and these 2 would be perfect cards to kind of add to that starter deck and update their block number at the same time. And then the third one I wanted to call out is kind of staple effects that don't necessarily affect your whole game plan, but can pretty drastically affect the texture of a meta. Red Rock here, the bar none best way to deal with a 10 cost Teach. When we hit rotation, it will be gone. So the best answer to a very powerful card in the meta will be gone from the meta. And there will be lots of these that are peppered throughout. If Ice Age hadn't been banned, it would have been on this list. And there's a lot of different cards that'll be in this kind of glue category that kind of fill in the gaps of any given synergy. Not always searchable in decks, so their presence will be pretty dramatically missed. So that's what I had to say about kind of other cards that'll be affected. Moving on to my conclusions. I want to say from this point, I am optimistic about rotation as a way to fight power creep. I don't think that there's no guarantees, but I'd like to believe that Bandai is interested in maintaining a healthy meta, and I think that the release valve that rotation represents is one that hopefully they will take advantage of. So couple things to be optimistic for with this system. It's a release valve for power creep, like I mentioned. The new player experience will be, I genuinely think, will be improved by this. That's a lot lower barrier to entry. You don't have to know as much. You don't have to go buy as much. And this will be something that gets more impactful the longer the game goes. And then finally, one of the main upsides to rotation compared to several other systems that I've heard people recommend is rotation happens on a schedule. You can write down on your calendar the day that rotation happens. Ban lists, for example, is another way of balancing metas. Ban lists do not happen on a schedule most of the time. They're things that if the meta gets too toxic, they ban a card. With rotation, you get the ability to rotate through formats, but it is one that happens like you can set your clock by it kind of thing. And I think that that's a big upside to rotation compared to other methods. Things to watch out for, or reasons why rotation might not work. If Bandai does not take the correct road, so to speak, and they do not turn off the power creep meters and the complexity creep meters, that is something where we get the downsides of rotation without kind of some of the upsides. It's not great. Another thing, and this is going to be a common refrain from people who are opposed to the rotation, there will be churn. Every rotation, somebody's going to be really upset that their deck was banned. Well, not banned, their deck was rotated, and they will choose not to buy into the new format. I think that in a system that has a good new player experience and a good healthy meta otherwise, the rotation will be replaced with new players, and those players who do fall off, they may move into the Eternal format, or if they leave for a while, they may also be enticed to come back. So that rotation turn is not necessarily you lose them and it's gone forever. The final thing I wanted to call out is there will be a bit of a split and a little bit of tension between Eternal and Standard. Whenever you take one format and you split it into two formats, people are going to pick which one they like better, and neither one is going to have quite as many as the whole unified format had together. That said, this is a problem that doesn't have to be either or. A lot of players will play both. I personally am going to be playing both Standard at my locals, and then I will sign up for Eternal tournaments all the time. It'll be fun to watch the meta development from two different places. So while this is something to watch out for, if there is too much split in the community, then that can be a negative thing. I don't think that it is necessarily a universal bad. So that was my thoughts on the rotation. If you have anything you want me to flesh out further or answer any questions that you might have, feel free to go down to the comments and drop them there. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks.